Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are wrestling with a challenge that has frustrated and delighted and just utterly confused humanity's greatest thinkers for, what is it, over 2,000 years.
Oh, yeah. Over 2,400 years. We're talking about Zeno's paradoxes.
Right. And it's really the ultimate head trip. You have this figure, Zeno of Elea, living centuries before the Common Era, and he looks at the world around him at people walking and arrows flying.
And he says, I know you see it. I know you experience movement every single day. But philosophically, logically, it's impossible.
It's such a bold claim, and his paradoxes, they weren't really meant to be physics problems, were they?
Not at all. They were ingenious philosophical traps. They were designed to expose these deep structural flaws in how we model everything, space, time, the very idea that you can even have multiple things existing at once.
And today, we're really going to be zeroing in on the two big ones. First, Achilles and the tortoise.
Which is all about breaking down space and distance.
And then the flying arrow, which does the exact same thing, but to time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Zeno's logic is like this incredibly sharp knife. It just slices reality into these pieces that are so small.
That the whole thing just vanishes. The idea of a continuous single act of motion, it just evaporates. You're left with dust.
And his logic is terrifyingly sound, but only if you accept one really big classical and, as we'll argue, flawed premise.
Which is?
That reality is a static, fixed container. A non-participatory backdrop, like a rigid stage where all the action happens.
So for our deep dive today, we're going to use this really radical lens of what the sources call the massive physics framework to offer, a complete resolution.
We're going to make the case that motion isn't a sequence of stops at all. It's a continuous, cohesive, and maybe most importantly, a fundamentally conscious act. And it's governed by a physics that cares more about dynamic balance than static points on a line.
Okay, so we need to unpack this, because I think the typical answer you get in high school is just, oh, calculus solved it.
Right. Infinite series converge. End of story.
But that only solves the math problem, right? It gives us the tool to calculate the end result, but it doesn't really touch Zeno's core philosophical challenge about fragmentation.
It never did. The structural problem remains. And our mission today is to show how this mathematical framework, which defines balance, this concept of action equaling zero and consciousness as foundational constants.
How that framework provides the necessary sort of architectural fix to Zeno's brilliant challenge.
You know, Zeno, completely unintentionally, was the first person to show that if you fragment physics too much, the model breaks. It just becomes unstable.
But what do you mean by unstable?
Well, the key insight from the sources is that for a theory of everything to work, it needs scale-independent laws. The rules have to work everywhere, at every zoom level.
From the quantum to the cosmic.
Precisely. And if your model of reality allows Achilles to get stuck in this infinite unresolved loop the moment you zoom in on the distance, then your model itself is broken. It's unstable.
Okay, so let's get into it. Let's define these paradoxes and really feel the flaw of division that Zeno uncovered.
Let's start with the classic, the definitive paradox of spatial fragmentation, Achilles and the tortoise.
What I love about this one is how simple the setup is. It's almost like a children's story, which is what makes it so devastatingly effective.
The setup is perfectly clean. You have Achilles, the fastest runner in all of Greece, and he's in a race with a slow tortoise.
And to make it fair, he gives the tortoise a little head start, let's say 100 yards.
Okay, so 100 yards, Zeno argues. Before Achilles can actually catch and pass the tortoise, he must first reach the spot where the tortoise started.
The 100-yard mark. Simple enough, makes sense.
But of course, by the time Achilles covers those first 100 yards, the tortoise, even as slow as it is, has moved forward.
Right, it's not just waiting for him. It's crawled a new, smaller distance, maybe 10 yards.
Exactly. So now the race has changed. Achilles must cover those 10 yards.
But again, while he's running those 10 yards, the tortoise inches forward again, say 1 yard this time.
So Achilles has to cover that 1 yard. And while he does that, the tortoise moves a tenth of a yard. And then 100th.
And the remaining distance, it's always divisible. There's always another gap to cross, no matter how tiny it gets.
And this is the intellectual trap that just snaps shut on your mind. Zeno's argument is that Achilles must successfully complete an infinite sequence of these little tasks.
Always reaching the point the tortoise just left.
Before he can do the one thing he's trying to do, which is actually pass the tortoise.
And mathematically, it's that famous series, 1/2 plus 1/4 plus 1/8, and so on, which we know adds up to the finite distance of 1.
Zeno's identification of the structural flaw here is just masterful. He's not arguing about the final number. He's arguing that movement cannot be composed of an infinite set of discrete completed stops.
If you always have one more step to take before you reach the goal, and the number of steps is infinite,
You never actually complete the task. You never get there.
and like we said, calculus with the concept of limits shows that an infinite series can converge to a finite number. We solved the math, but the deeper question is, did we ever really solve the nature of motion itself?
I would argue no, we didn't. At least not with classical physics. The paradox forces us to ask a really uncomfortable question. Is distance really made up of an infinite number of infinitesimal points? Or is it a continuous, unbroken whole?
And if you assume it's made of all these separate, discrete points, which is what Zeno's division relies on,
Then you have a huge problem. How can an infinite collection of static points suddenly cohere into a single dynamic flowing act? Zeno proved that when you slice reality too finely, the whole system just breaks down into a kind of philosophical absurdity.
it's the classic problem of reductionism, isn't it? You break the car down into all its nuts and bolts, hoping to understand carness, but in the process, the car disappears.
That's a perfect analogy, and our sources identify this as a fundamental instability in modeling reality. The MART framework is insistent on this point. A true unified theory needs scale-independent laws.
Meaning the rules have to be consistent at all levels.
Right. If the rule for the whole system Achilles running is coherent and works, but the rule for the parts, the infinite fractional steps, leads to paralysis and contradiction, then your model is fundamentally flawed.
If Achilles were relying only on classical physics to get him to the finish line, he'd still be out there running, stuck in that loop.
He'd be stuck forever.
Okay, so let's shift gears from space to time. Let's talk about the flying arrow paradox. This one, to me, feels even more jarring. It challenges our most basic gut-level assumption about how time works.
The arrow paradox goes right for the jugular. It directly attacks the idea of time as a sequence of fixed moments, like frames in a film.
So Zeno's argument is, if time is composed of these discrete, indivisible instants,
Then we have to be able to look at the state of a flying arrow within any single one of those instants.
and in that single instant, like a high-speed photograph, a single frame of the film,
The arrow is just there. It's occupying a space that is precisely equal to its own length.
it's not half in one place and half in another, it's just in one spot.
And if it occupies a space equal to itself, it cannot possibly be moving within that instant. For that tiny frozen moment, it is at rest. It is completely static.
So if I film the arrow's entire flight, and then I go back and I look at the footage frame by single frame,
And in every single frame, the arrow is stationary.
how does the motion ever happen? It's just a sequence of static, individual stills. Where does the movement come from?
This is the genius of Zeno's structural flaw identification for time. Motion, which is by definition change over time, cannot logically emerge from a sequence of static, unchanging states. This just completely demolishes the classical concept of time as a fixed absolute dimension.
I can see the foundational assumption he's exploiting here. He's assuming that reality is this pre-existing four-dimensional thing, a space-time manifold.
A fixed, unchanging state.
Right, a container. And all the objects, the arrows and people, they just move within this pre-made container.
And that, according to the Matat physics and our sources, is the core error. If you define the stage first, if you treat space-time as a rigid passive box,
Then Zeno wins every single time.
every time, because you've guaranteed that motion has to violate its own definition when you zoom in on it. The paradox forces us to question the very stage itself. Is time truly independent of the events that unfold within it?
You know, it's funny. It sounds like Zeno was accidentally pointing us toward a more quantum mechanical view, where the act of observation changes the reality.
It's so ironic, isn't it?
Yeah, he was trying to prove that reality never changes, that it's all an illusion. But to do it, he showed that if you assume time and space are static, you get a logical contradiction that makes change impossible.
He backed himself right into the solution without knowing it.
Okay, so this is the perfect place to transition. Zeno's paradoxes hold up, but only if reality is this passive, fixed, non-participatory stage.
So the matter framework comes in and essentially says, the stage isn't a stage. It's an adaptive, self-improving live feed, and the observer is the critical processing unit running the whole show.
That's a great analogy. It completely refutes Zeno's static assumption by integrating the observer back into the dynamics of the system.
Let's start right there, because Zeno's arguments, and frankly most of classical physics, they just leave the conscious observer out of the equation. They're treated like a ghost watching the machine.
Right, a spectator.
The sources state this explicitly. The paradoxes only work because the observer is excluded. In the MATA framework, the observer isn't just a passive witness. It's defined as the active physical operator that selects, renders, and integrates reality.
So the observer is part of the machinery.
The observer is the machinery. And if you remove that physical operator from the loop, you break the rendering cycle. The whole system freezes. And that frozen broken state is Zeno's paradox.
So if the observer is the active processor, then motion is a function of that processing. It's not something that happens in time.
It's a process that generates time.
Wow.
Absolutely. Time and space are not pre-existing fixed containers. They are rendered outputs. They are generated by the unfolding of informational integration. The very existence of time is synonymous with the existence of change and experience and the accumulation of meaning.
So if there's no observer, no one engaged in rendering information,
Yeah.
say a system at maximum entropy or just deep unconsciousness.
Then experientially and physically, time does not unfold coherently. No rendering, no time. It's that direct.
So the speed of Achilles, the flight of the arrow, that's not happening in a fixed space-time. Space-time is the dimensional output generated by the flow of that event.
That is the profound reframing. And the sources get really specific about how this flow works. It's called the core cycle of reality. The universe operates as this self-improving rendering loop.
Okay, break that down for us.
It moves in a sequence. It starts with pure potential. That potential leads to variation, which the framework denotes with the letter B.
B for beauty, as we've discussed in other deep dives, the force of novelty and expansion.
Exactly. This variation then generates definitive structure, which is denoted by S.
S for structure. The pattern, the form, the information.
Right. B is the creative potential. S is the stable pattern. So that structure then leads to a measurable experience, which is then refined through a process of integration.
Potential to variation to structure, to experience to integration. And then it loops back.
And then it loops. It's constantly moving from a state of pure potential, collapsing it into a measurable pattern, having an experience of that pattern, and then using the information from that experience to refine the next loop.
So motion is possible because the universe has this built-in directionality. It's always moving toward greater integration and coherence.
Motion isn't some random mechanical shift. It's a necessary consequence of this directional evolution. The universe is learning, and motion is how it explores the state space.
That makes movement itself a requirement for cosmic learning. That's a huge conceptual leap from Zeno's world, which was static and unchanging.
A massive leap. And this movement, this entire cycle, is powered by the fundamental need for balance between these two forces, S and B.
Structure and beauty.
Right. We said structure S is pattern, predictability, local balance. Beauty B is the current of expansion, novelty, creative potential. Motion and energy, according to this framework, emerge from the local dominance or resonance of beauty.
So motion is the impulse for novelty. It's the force that perturbs the system and pushes it away from getting stuck, from stasis.
Yes. Structure represents stability, which is essential. But a system that gets stuck only in structure, it freezes, it stagnates. Motion, driven by B, is the necessary perturbation away from that static point, and it's absolutely required for any kind of growth or learning.
And this brings us to what the framework says defines a healthy living system.
Which is emphatically not stasis.
Right.
The sources are explicit. Static systems die. They lack the energy they need for renewal and adaptation. Healthy systems do not seek a static point of perfect S dominance, where everything is perfectly ordered and predictable.
What do they do instead?
They continuously orbit a dynamic balance region. The term used is a limit cycle.
A limit cycle. A closed, repetitive trajectory, like a constant rhythm or a heartbeat.
Exactly. A limit cycle is the mathematical signature of a living process. It's not like a simple pendulum that swings back and forth, but eventually loses energy and stops.
It's self-sustaining.
It's a self-sustaining, non-decaying orbit. It requires a constant input and output of energy dissipation and renewal to maintain its trajectory. So notion, in this view, is required for anything lifelike. It's required for learning, for renewal, for adaptation.
So Achilles stops to analyze the infinite halves. He achieves a kind of static balance.
The S-dominant state. And metaphorically, he dies. He's no longer a living learning system. The act of running itself, maintaining that limit cycle, is the only way to stay alive.
This just completely flips the paradox on its head. Zeno says the stops are what prevent the run, but Mott says the stops aren't even stops. They're just points on a continuously generating, self-sustaining loop. The run creates the points, not the other way around.
You've got it.
Okay, so let's focus back on Achilles specifically, and the mathematical core of his paradox. The claim that an infinite number of positive steps, the half, the quarter, the eighth, can't sum up to a finite cohesive distance.
Right. We've acknowledged calculus gives us the answer that they do converge, but the philosophical problem of fragmentation is still there.
So how does the mat response reframe the math itself?
This is a really radical part of the source material. It argues that the very fragmentation Zeno exploited arose because traditional mathematics, which is highly linear, did something very specific.
Okay.
It collapsed what should have been dual polarity complementary axes into a single axis model using negative values.
Whoa, hold on. That's a huge claim. Are you saying that the architectural flaw that Zeno found way back in the 5th century BC was actually introduced when we invented negative numbers?
In a sense, yes. The flaw is in modeling reality using one-dimensional math that relies on destructive subtraction.
Destructive subtraction.
When you use subtraction, you imply that a quantity can be removed, annihilated, or destroyed. This is the root of so many linear paradoxes, including Zeno's. The moment you slice one half from one, you create the conceptual space for the fragmentation that he exploits.
And I'm just thinking mathematically. 1 minus a half equals a half. It works. Where does the mat framework differ?
Mat physics replaces that single-axis model of destructive subtraction and negative values with what it calls dual polarity complementary axes.
Okay, what does that mean in practice?
Instead of viewing the remaining distance, that half as a diminished version of the whole, we're asked to view the original whole, the number 1, as existing on two complementary axes at the same time.
The S and B axes again, structure and beauty.
Or form and content, or any number of complementary pairs. So if Achilles is running 100 yards, that distance isn't just a length on a line. It's a relational field defined by complementary forces.
So subtraction, which implies taking something away and destroying it,
is replaced by relational transformations, or the use of what the sources call a counter mode. When Achilles covers half the distance, the entire system transforms its state of coherence relative to the goal. The act isn't a reduction of a static line. It's an integration of a dynamic field.
That still feels a little abstract. Can you define counter mode in simpler terms?
Think of it like a relational shift. In traditional math, if you subtract a half, that value is gone. In what this framework calls polarity calculus, all variables are non-negative magnitudes. They represent real quantities. The counter mode is the complementary force needed to balance the movement.
Okay.
So when Achilles runs half the distance, the act of doing the running generates the necessary coherence, the S, on the structure axis to integrate that movement. That act of integration then activates the next field of potential distance, the B, on the beauty axis.
So Zeno's division into a half, a quarter, an eighth, that isn't the real problem.
The division isn't the problem. The flaw is trying to model a dynamic, flowing process using static, fragmented numbers that have no relational meaning. Motion is the relationship between S and B flowing toward a goal, not static chunks being chipped away from a line.
So Zeno's Achilles gets stuck because his reality is defined by these static chunks that have to be subtracted. But the modded Achilles sees his path as a continuous, dynamic relationship that's constantly updating itself.
And this dynamic update is forced to happen. It's not optional, because the universal operating system is hardwired to prioritize coherence over fragmentation.
Zeno's paradox, that state of an infinite, unresolved calculation.
That's a state of maximum instability. It's a chaotic loop with no stable, low-energy state. The physics of the universe simply won't allow it.
So the physics rejects the paradox instantly.
Absolutely. The most fundamental law of existence, according to these sources, is that existence itself must cost nothing. It cannot repay incoherence.
And that's formalized in an equation, right?
It is. It's called the Mad action functional. Delta A equals 0. Delta matha 1,5.
The mad action functional. Let's pause and really unpack that, because this seems to be the core universal rule that defeats Zeno. What exactly is the A in that equation?
A represents the total integrated action of a system. You can think of it as the total informational coherence, or maybe even the universe's balance sheet of meaning.
And the delta symbol, the triangle.
That just means the change in. So the equation is saying that the change in the total integrated coherence of the universe must be 0. It's the law of conservation of coherence.
Why 0? Why does coherence have to be conserved? What would happen if it wasn't?
Because the universe operates under a principle of least action. It's always seeking maximum thermodynamic efficiency. If the change in coherence wasn't 0, the system would either have to be spontaneously creating energy out of nowhere, which violates conservation, or it would be fragmenting into irreducible waste, which is maximum disorder.
So the act of Achilles running across the field.
Is simply the most thermodynamically favorable path.
Hmm.
It is the field seeking its lowest possible energy state, and the shortest, most direct path is the one that conserves the most coherence.
So when Achilles runs, the physical energy he's expending with his muscles is immediately and perfectly balanced by the informational integration of that movement into this universal MACVAT field.
That's the core idea.
The infinite steps Zeno imagines aren't a stopping mechanism at all. They're just a mathematical projection of the continuous flow that is conserving this A value.
You've got it. Motion is conservation in action. If Zeno's infinite segmentation were physically possible, the system would violate that delta A equals 0 rule by getting locked into a high-energy, unresolved loop. The universe's coherence requirement forces the system to collapse the potential all those infinite segments into the single cohesive act of the run.
Okay, let's bring the same logic to the arrow paradox. We're shifting from space to time, but the core issue is the same: fragmentation. Zeno assumes movement can't emerge from a sequence of static instants.
And again, his logic is flawless if you accept his premise, that an instant is a passive, frozen point in time where the arrow is at rest.
This is where the Mayat reframing of time becomes so powerful.
It is. We have to first just completely internalize that time is not an absolute fixed container. It's not a river we're all floating down. Time is generated. The sources say it is a function of consciousness, not a backdrop.
The experience of time unfolding is the same thing as the sequential accumulation of integrated information.
Right. So the universe doesn't have some master clock ticking away somewhere outside of all the events that are happening,
So the arrow moves forward not because a clock is ticking.
but because meaning accumulates. The direction of time, the arrow of time, is directly proportional to the accumulation of integrated meaning. If the rate of meaning accumulation slows down, or if it just repeats without any novelty, our perception of time literally warps.
Which sounds like a built-in guarantee of continuity, the very thing Zeno tried to break.
It is a guarantee. Causality itself is redefined in this model. It's the sequential update of relational data across the entire mod field. This process ensures coherence between successive rendered frames. The whole universe is synchronizing its update so that the next moment flows logically and coherently from the previous one.
That continuous synchronization prevents the fragmentation that Zeno's paradox relies on.
It makes it impossible.
Okay, so if the universe is this continuous flow of updated coherence, how do we define that instant that Zeno focused on? If it's not a static stop, what is it?
The framework introduces the idea of discrete snap points, but these are not static rests. A snap point is an active event. It occurs where the structure, the S wavefront, and the beauty, the B wavefront, intersect perfectly.
And that interception results in?
A stable reality state, a moment of perfect synchronization. An instant is an energetic intersection, a moment where pure potential momentarily resolves into a measurable, stable pattern.
That's a very different picture of a moment.
It is. And this leads to another key concept from the sources. Each one of these snap points corresponds to a quantum of awareness.
A quantum of awareness, what does that mean?
It's defined as the smallest measurable unit of consciousness-material coupling. It is the minimum viable unit of experience that must be rendered for an observer to maintain coherence with their reality.
That's a huge claim. How do we even conceptualize a measurable unit of consciousness-material coupling in a practical way?
Think of it as the smallest packet of information required for you, as an observer, to execute a successful, coherent relational update with your environment. It relates to the frequency at which your S field, your pattern recognition system, can resolve the B field, the incoming novelty.
All right.
So when the arrow is flying, it is never resting between these quantum moments. The consciousness of the observer is moving through the fourth dimension by sequencing these collapses, these snap points.
So motion isn't a series of stops.
Motion is the continuous act of rendering change between these stable synchronization points. The arrow is never at rest. It is continuously updating its position within this collapsing rendering field.
This also offers a really spectacular new way to think about relativity, especially time dilation. In classical physics, when an object moves near the speed of light, time slows down for it because of the geometry of spacetime. How does that work in a universe that's being actively rendered?
The sources suggest time dilation emerges as a problem of rendering bandwidth allocation.
Like on a computer.
Exactly like on a computer.
Mm.
Motion, especially very high velocity motion, demands a huge amount of coherence maintenance
Yeah.
for an object to move incredibly fast while remaining physically intact and aligned with the rest of the universe.
The processing power needed to maintain its physical coherence, its structure, its S field, has to go up exponentially.
Right. The system is dedicating immense processing power just to keeping the physical object together and aligned with everything else. But the total available rendering bandwidth in any given system is finite.
So if more energy is allocated to physical coherence because you're moving fast,
There is less energy available for the slower, more complex, subjective process of time integration. Your experience of time passing, which is what d-tau represents, decreases.
so my personal clock slows down because my consciousness is consuming all its resources on just instantaneous physical alignment.
Rather than on the accumulation and integration of complex meaning.
That's a fundamentally different model. Time slowing down isn't a geometric property of a fixed backdrop. It's a dynamic consequence of resource management by a conscious field.
And we see evidence of this in our own perception all the time. Time feels like it stretches on forever when we're having a new, complex, meaningful experience.
And it vanishes when an experience is low resolution or just repetitive, like a long, boring drive.
Because the system needs minimal bandwidth to integrate repetitive data. This direct link between time perception and information density, it just shatters Zeno's static frame assumption. It proves time is dynamic, not absolute.
You know, this entire framework, Zeno, slicing reality into infinite tasks, and then Mathot providing this coherence fix-it, moves way beyond physics. It perfectly describes a profound psychological state we all experience.
It really does.
We all know that feeling of staring at a massive goal, like starting a new career or writing a book, and just getting frozen because our mind instinctively breaks it down into an infinite number of tiny, impossible steps.
That is the psychological Zeno.
It maps perfectly onto what the Maat sources call the failure modes, specifically this cycle of internal imbalance and stagnation.
Yeah, the mind is faced with this huge potential, this B field, and it tries to impose structure, an S field, a plan. But if the ratio is wrong, the whole system just collapses into fragmentation and dissociation.
So let's use that S&B language to really diagnose this psychological paralysis, what the sources call collapse, leading to fragmentation, leading to dissociation.
Okay, so if Zeno's paralysis takes over your mind, it's a failure mode where structure S dominates completely. The sources call it S-hat overdominance. This is extreme rigidity, perfectionism, analysis paralysis.
The system freezes because it's analyzing the infinite steps without ever daring to take one.
Exactly. The desire for a perfect, guaranteed plan or the intense fear of making a mistake causes the system to just lock down. You are trapped in an S-loop, endlessly calculating and recalculating the half, the quarter, the eighth segments of your project, but never executing the integrated act of starting.
The perfect example is the person who spends 3 months researching which laptop to buy. They have spreadsheets, they've read every review, but they never actually click the order button because they're terrified of that moment of imperfection, of choosing the wrong one.
That's it. The system achieves maximum S, maximum rigidity, but minimal B, minimal creative movement. The result is stagnation and no evolutionary learning. Now, think about the opposite feeling. Total chaotic overwhelm.
Right, that feeling of having way too many tabs open in your brain, too many goals, too much potential, and so nothing gets done.
That's when beauty, B, dominates completely. B-hat overdominance. The system destabilizes into chaotic dispersion. Too much novelty, too many options, shiny object syndrome.
And a complete lack of any coherent structure to bind all that potential together.
You're constantly starting new half segments, new ideas, but you have no structure to integrate them into a finished whole.
So the necessary response to that S-hat overdominance, the rigidity and the freezing, is described in the sources as needing to reintroduce safe novelty entropy. You have to microactivate the creative force.
You have to interrupt the rigid pattern. The path forward, the equivalent of Achilles finally taking that first imperfect step, is achieved by restoring the functional limit cycle of the observer.
The goal is to get back into that healthy flow state, that constant orbit between potential and structure, not getting frozen at one of the extremes.
That's the whole game.
So let's make this really practical. If I am staring at my to-do list, which feels like an infinite division of tasks, and I'm paralyzed, how do I apply this physics? How do I restart that functional cycle?
Well, Healing, or starting any major project, is fundamentally about restoring the phase alignment between the different subcomponents of your consciousness.
Mm.
And the sources say this is achieved by applying something called the compassion constant, K sub E.
The compassion constant, KE. Now, is this a measurable quantity like the speed of light, or is it more of a conceptual relational operator?
It's described as the universal relational constant that governs the non-local synchronization of information fields. Functionally, for us, it's the mechanism that generates the necessary coherence, the S, to integrate the novelty, the B.
So KE acts like a safety net operator.
That's a great way to put it. It dissolves the high-energy fragmentation, those S loops of paralyzing analysis, and it forces the system toward its lowest possible energy state.
Which is connection and coherence. So when we're psychologically paralyzed, we're locked in a state of maximum internal resistance. Applying KE, which is really just conscious compassion or even just curiosity toward the task, that's the functional switch that unlocks the flow.
Absolutely. We so often wait until we feel confident or perfect before we start something. The main framework suggests that confidence is the result of taking action, not the prerequisite for it.
You start the progress loop the second you apply empathy or curiosity.
Because those states generate the initial coherence required to sustain the act. The moment you take one small step, however imperfect, you satisfy that delta A equals 0 rule for that moment, and the universe confirms your motion.
That is such a critical psychological shift. Progress isn't about fighting and conquering the perceived infinite division. It's about moving with the fundamental law of math. The act of synchronization applying coherence and care is the mechanism that collapses that infinite distance into a single, cohesive step.
Zeno convinced us that logic makes movement impossible. The Mayat response is that consciousness makes movement necessary and, in the end, inevitable.
So this entire deep dive into Zeno's paradoxes, it really reveals that they were never flaws in the world. They were profound flaws in the ancient model of physics that treated reality as static and linear and non-conscious.
The illusion of the infinite steps, whether you're talking about tiny fragments of space or infinitesimal instants of time, it just dissolves when you realize that reality is a continuous conscious rhythm.
Motion works because the observer is the dynamic rendering engine that collapses potential into cohesive, continuous acts. And it guarantees coherence, that delta A equals 0 at every single step.
The journey across the room, crossing the finish line, finishing that daunting project, it's revealed as a single continuous act of coherence, not a never-ending series of stops you have to overcome.
And that profound understanding has massive implications for how we tackle the challenges in our own lives. When you find yourself paralyzed by a challenge, when you meet your own psychological Zeno, the answer isn't to try to eliminate the infinite steps through more rigid analysis.
The answer is to simply take the next step with coherence and care, and allow the system's natural physics of flow to take over.
You know, that process of dissolving high-energy fragmentation is perfectly captured by the idea of reconciliation or forgiveness. The sources describe forgiveness as the ultimate entropy reset. It dissolves informational resistance and that high-energy fragmentation back into the unified field.
It's pure physics. When we hold an internal conflict, a rigid expectation, or a grudge, we are locking our own system into a high-energy Zeno loop. It requires continuous, unsustainable energy input just to maintain that state of fragmentation.
And forgiveness, or just applying that compassion constant KE to ourselves or the situation,
Is the physics of least action. It restores dynamic flow. It instantly satisfies the universe's coherence requirement.
which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you, the listener.
If the path to progress is always paved with coherence, and forgiveness is the entropy reset that dissolves high-energy fragmentation back into the unified field, then ask yourself this.
What perceived infinite distance in your own life? Be it a long-delayed project, a difficult conversation, or an unresolved trauma are you struggling to cross?
And what single act of compassionate synchronization, either forgiveness or just radical curiosity, is required to collapse that distance into a single cohesive forward step?